Welcome to the sixth class of this fresh start in 3D modeling. In previous classes, here's what we have covered. In class 1, we learned some fundamentals about 3D design. We went through the Cinema4D interface. We learned some important modeling tools and we understood how subdivisions work. In class 2, we learned how to model 3D products, starting with cylinders as our primitives. We also practiced by modeling 4 different products with their detailed covers. In class 3, we learned how to create holes and extrude new shapes from an existing mesh. In class 4, we learned how to model a complete kettle by applying lessons from previous classes. In class 5, we learned how to model a headset from a flat surface. We also learned how to achieve that using the symmetrical modeling technique. In this final class of the series, we'll cover basic animation, material creation, lighting, and rendering. There are several ways you can take part in this series and also support the series and the channel at large. First, you can kindly subscribe to the channel to get more classes and to get notified for subsequent series and 3D content. And you can also join my 3D community on Telegram for more conversations, tips, challenges, resource sharing, and growth opportunities. Then you can also grab the Fresh Start bundle of clay image references. It consists of over 25 clay product references to help you practice and model more products after you take part in this training. Also, if you're into NFTs, you can patronize my Vogbot NFT project on OpenSea that has a crazy utility where I create a free animated fashion NFT for every piece sold. The process of creating materials, shading or texturing, together with lighting and rendering are processes that work hand in hand. What this means is that when you create your materials, you need to see how it reacts to light in your scene, and when you create your light, you need to see how it affects the materials in your scene. And the way you see how they interact with each other is through your render view. Note that rendering is the process that aggregates everything you've done in your project to produce your final outcome. There are inbuilt render engines and also external ones. These render engines vary based on how they interpret the information in your scene to produce the best visual and realistic result. And most render engines come with their own materials, lights, and cameras to ensure better interpretation of your scene. In this tutorial, we'll learn how to use inbuilt render engines to achieve good results. Animation is simply recording and applying motion to objects, tools, modifiers, and elements using their attributes or properties. To have a foundational understanding of animation, you need to understand these two terms, frame and keyframe. First, to explain what the frame is, let's break down a word that you're more familiar with, and that's the word video or movie. Now, every video that you watch is made up of a sequence of images that, when compiled and encoded, produces the motion that you see. This is why it's also called motion picture, which simply means moving images. The images in the sequence will gradually differ from each other based on what is being recorded. And this also explains what happens when you pause a video. You freeze a particular frame or image at any time you want. So we can refer to a single or individual image or unit of an entire sequence as a frame. Now let's go to the second term, which is keyframing. A keyframe records the attributes or properties of an object, tool, effect, or element at a particular frame or point in time. Now the key word here is recording attributes and frame or point in time. Please take note of these two words. So the transition from one keyframe to another is what creates your animation. Now, to practically understand keyframing, let's use this cube for demonstration. Now the task for us here is to animate this cube on the z-axis. So we want to move this cube from here to this point and then also bring it back, but we want this action to be recorded in our timeline. Now remember our keywords, frame or point in time. Here's our timeline, and this is where you can find your frames. So these numbers represent your frames, and as I move, it changes to different frames. So currently this is frame 30 as it highlights here. You can increase the number of frames you have in your timeline by just increasing this number here, and you can also reduce it. And the number you input here marks the end of the timeline. The number you input here marks the beginning of the timeline. But even when you've marked the number of frames you want and the end of the timeline, you can also expand some areas in the timeline just to see your frames better. We can also take this back. These icons here are used to control movement in our timeline. So this is the play. This one helps you go to your next frame. This one helps you go to your previous frame. This helps you go to the beginning of your timeline. This helps you go to the end of your timeline. And then these two keys help you move from one keyframe to another. Then these keys are used for keyframing. So our next keyword was our attributes or properties, and this is our attribute panel here in Cinema4D. So selecting this cube, these are the attributes of the cube, and if I go to the coordinates, that's where we find what we want to work with. So we want to animate the position on the z-axis. So this is the position we want. So if I just click and drag this, you see that it moves only on the z-axis. Now to keyframing, there are 3 ways you can apply a keyframe here. You can apply it in the attribute panel here by clicking this circle, and when you click it, it becomes red this way. And once it becomes red, it means this property has been recorded at this particular frame in your timeline. So you see, you must always note where you are in your timeline. Once I take it out of frame 90, you see that our keyframe goes away, but once I take it back to 90, you see that that returns. The other way we can add a keyframe is by recording our active objects here. And what this does is that it records the entire position, scale, and rotation of your object. So if you don't want to always manually come here to click the position, you can just record it here. So if I check this here, you see that everything is recorded at that particular frame in our timeline. Then this is our auto keying. It automatically adds keyframe for us. So if I select this, our viewport will have a red outline, and that means any action we take from now on will be recorded. So I'll set the initial keyframe here. I'll just record active objects here. And then if I go to another point in our timeline, and I just move this object, then you see that another keyframe will automatically be added for us here. So let's go ahead to animate this cube. Let's set the position here to 0. So to animate it, I'll go to frame 0. Then I'll increase our number of frames to 180. So I'll select the cube, make sure I'm on that coordinate. Then on this axis, I'll keyframe the position here at frame 0. Please always take note of the frame you are in your timeline when you're keyframing. If I keyframe this attribute twice in the same position, I've not made an animation. The system will just assume that I'm trying to modify my previous keyframe. So I have to move to another point in my timeline. So I'm going to move to frame 90. And now I'll change the attribute of my cube. So I'll increase this to this point. Remember, now I'm on frame 90. Then I'll keyframe this as frame 90. So now we have 2 attributes that have been recorded. One at frame 0, which is where our object is at this position, and one at frame 90, which is where our object is at this position. So if I play this from frame 0, you see now that our object moves from the point that was set before to the new point. And that's because the attribute of our cube is now transitioning between the parameters we set in both keyframes. So to animate it back, I'll go to frame 180 here. So I can keyframe it here again, but it's also the same thing as dragging it back here on the z-axis. So I can just take this back to 0. Now watch what happens when I don't keyframe. I've not added a keyframe here, so once I move around my timeline, it returns to that position because this keyframe has not been recorded. So let's just do that again. I'll type 0 and then I'll keyframe it to that position. So now we can move from point A to point B. So let's apply this for our headset. So we'll be animating this headset and also animating a camera movement. So the first thing I'll do will be to group these 2 objects in a null. So I'll select this and hit Alt G on my keyboard to group them. And I'll name this headset. Before you animate, it's key to know where your axis is set, because that's what will serve as the anchor point for your object to rotate or move around. So this is currently set at the middle and I'm fine with that. If you wanted to change this, you can check this axis here and just move only the axis around and place it where you want to place it. So for instance, if I place it at this area and I choose to rotate this object, it will rotate from this anchor point here. This technique is good for animating doors. So here we have our headset. Next, I want to bring our camera in. So I'll go over here and then I'll just select this camera. Now our camera has a lot of settings, but we'll barely be working on any of the settings. We just need to animate the camera. So currently we have the camera, but it's not yet active. To make a camera active, just check this icon here and make sure it's white. So now you're looking through the camera. And then once you uncheck this, you're looking out of the camera. It's great to work outside of the camera and move your scene around. But once you bring your camera, whatever movement you make becomes the position of the camera. So before we go ahead, I want to change the dimension we're working with. So I'll go over here to my render settings, and then under output I'll just make the height match the width. So I'll just make this 1280. I can make this 1080 by 1080, but let's just leave it at 1280 by 1280. So as you can see, this has now adjusted to a 1:1 dimension here. So I'll zoom in. I'm still looking through my camera. My camera is active here. So I'll just set the default position of my camera. I think this is fine for me. So temporarily I'll go out of our camera. We can also hide the camera from our viewport if it's obstructing you. So I'll just come here and make this red, click twice, and that will be hidden. So now let's animate this headset. We want to animate the rotation of the headset. So once I select this headset, we can use the same technique we used before, and we can also use our auto key in here. So I'll go to frame 0 and I'll just record everything, the position, scale, and rotation, as you can see here. I'll switch to my rotation tool. I'll go to frame 90. Then here I'll check auto keying so that the movement we'll make will be recorded. I'll go to frame 90 here. Then I'll just rotate this object this way. And maybe I'll stop here. So as you can see, a keyframe has been added at frame 90 and the rotation here has been recorded. So if we go back to frame 0 and I just play this, this is what we should have. Now, once you understand the behavior between these two frames, you know that no matter what you do in between these two keyframes, they will always end up at this position that you've recorded here. So you can actually use that to create more dynamic movement. For instance, if we come to frame 45 and we just rotate only the x-axis this way, once we play this back now, we should have something that looks like this. So it's also key to know that if I drag this keyframe closer to this other one, this area will be faster and this area will be slower. And that's just working with time. Another way to achieve effects like this is using your graph editor, where you can control the speed and ease of movement on your keyframes. You can also control a lot about your animation, but we won't be going into that for this basic tutorial. Now the next thing we want to do is to animate our camera. So let's just bring our camera back in and I'll make the camera view active. So I'll set the initial position of this camera, take it out a little bit. Now I'm not recording anything. Just so that this is not confusing, know when you're recording or when you're keyframing and when you're working. Okay, so now I'm ready to animate our camera. So I just want to animate a simple zoom in. So I'll enable my auto keying, then I'll record the coordinates of the camera here. As you can see, that's added a keyframe for us here. Then I'll go to frame 90 and I'll just zoom in. Remember, my auto keying is on, so it will record the activities I'm making now. So I've moved in. You see that's recorded the position. I can also just rotate a little bit this way, and you see now it has recorded the rotation. So let's go to the beginning and let's play this. So I'll just zoom in a little bit more. So that works for the animation we want to create for this headset. Before we create our material, let's quickly set up a studio backdrop for our project. So I'll add a plane. I'll set the width segments to 1, height segments to 1. I'll scale this. I'll make it editable. Go to my edge mode, then I'll duplicate this particular edge. Then I can also duplicate this particular edge this way. So here I'll bevel this edge. I'll hit M and S, and then I'll bevel this, and I'll increase our subdivisions. So to create a material, here is our material panel. So you can create a material by going to create here and selecting new material, or you can just double click in an empty space here and to create a new material for you. Then if you double click on the material itself, it will then bring out the channels that you can work with. Now all these channels are used to create the look and feel that you want. For this basic material, we'll only be working with the color and reflectance channel. Now color controls our color, as the name implies, and here we can also add an image to derive our texture, but we're not working with textures for this tutorial. Now our reflectance controls our specular and reflection. In other software and render engines, these two channels are merged into your specular. So if you check your reflectance, you see that you have your default specular, and under add here you can add some presets here. So to create a material for the body here, let's set the color to red. To apply the texture, left click, drag and place it on the object you want, or you can just place it on the object here in your object panel. So under our reflectance, I'll just clear everything we have here. I'll just click remove, then I'll hit add, then I'll add this preset GGX. And the first thing I'll change here is our brightness. I'll reduce our brightness to about 60%. So this object is reacting to a default environment in Cinema4D to preview your texture. So you can see the reflection and shininess. So these are the things we're about to start controlling. Now after changing the brightness to 60%, let's go to the layer Fresnel. Let's go under here, layer Fresnel, and then change this to conductor. Then here we'll leave reflection strength at 100%. Now roughness controls the roughness of our reflections and shininess. If you look through this object, you see that it looks like a mirror. But if I gradually increase this roughness, you see how that becomes blurry. If I increase this more, it almost disappears. So we can leave our roughness at 15%. Specular strength to control how shiny the object to be when light hits it. So if I increase our specular strength, you see that will now take more light. And if I reduce this, it will take less light. So let's just leave this at 15% also. And that should work for our body texture. Now you can play around with these options as you like. You can change this to dielectric and then see what happens. But the best time to play around will be when we bring in our lights and our render view. And then you can just keep changing these parameters. I'll leave this as conductor. So let's duplicate this to apply it on this other area. So I will hold Control, left click and just drag in this position to duplicate. So for this, let's just set this to a black color. So I'll take this down to this area, maybe 12%. Let's drag and drop it. I go to the reflectance, then the roughness. I'll just increase this guy's roughness. Let's say maybe 24%. Then maybe the specular strength, we can set that to 30%. And we can reduce the brightness here to like 30%. So next, let's add our lights. So what I'll be doing is that I'll be adding a simple 3-point lighting setup. So in Cinema4D, there are different types of lights you can use for your scene. So if you come over to the light option here, you left click and hold it, it will bring these options for you. So you can add a spotlight, target light, IS light, sunlight, area light, or add an omni light. Again, you can experiment how all this light works when we bring our render view. But for this tutorial, we'll work majorly with our area light. So once you bring a light in, it starts showing you how the light is affecting your scene. But if you want to see your full object to continue working without the light effect, you can change your shading mode. So if I go to display and I change this to quick shading, it will disable the effect of the light. So I'll set up 3-point lighting, key light, fill light, and backlight. So I'll set our key light around this area. I'll just move this, then I can adjust the size of the lights this way. Again, you don't need to perfectly place it. Once you start seeing the effect, you can then adjust the light accordingly. It's a very flexible process. So under our light, there are a lot of attributes, but we'll just need a few. So under intensity for our key light, this should be our brightest light. So I'll set this to 120%. Then I'll change the shadow to area. So note that you're not going to see the proper impact of this light on our object until we render the object or we preview it. So for now, we're just setting up the light. One thing I've not created is the texture of the background, so we can just quickly create that now. Let's use this material we made before. I'll leave the color as white. For reflectance, I remove everything. Then maybe I'll just add only reflection legacy here. And I'll just change the brightness to 50%. That's all. So I'll drag and drop that on our background. This might be distracting for now, so I won't drop it yet. So let's continue setting up our lights. So say we're good with our key light. Let's just duplicate this light. So I'll hold Control and then just drag this. And I'll set up a fill light opposite the key light. Just reduce this a bit. I'll set the intensity of this to 80%. And I'll set up a backlight here. Then I'll set the backlight to 50%. So let's just name this key, fill, and back. So we can also change the colors of the lights when we start previewing this, but let's see how this has taken effect. So before we do that, we have one more setting to make, and that's our render settings. Remember, as I mentioned, these processes work hand in hand. So we want to be able to preview this and allow our system calculate the effects of this light properly on this object. So I'll go over here to my render settings. These are the render engines you can use. I can leave this as standard. I can pick physical. This is Anode, my external render engine, and this is Octane, my external render engine. Then we'll go to effect. We'll add global illumination. Global illumination helps to ensure indirect and realistic lighting in our scene. It goes beyond recognizing the light coming directly from the light source to reflecting how that light bounces from one object to another. Then we'll also add ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion helps to calculate the extent to which different areas in our scene is exposed to light. With ambient occlusion on, the areas that are more obscure to the impact of light will be darker, and the areas more exposed to the impact of light will be lighter. This helps us achieve more realistic effects of light. So under ambient occlusion, we can change accuracy here to 100%. We can increase the maximum samples, maybe drop this at 80 or 120. Any number that's high, or you can leave it low depending on your system capacity. And then under global illumination, I'll change the secondary method to light mapping, and then the samples, let's just set this at high. Then one more thing we can do here is to go on to anti-aliasing and then change this from geometry to best. So now let's preview what we have here. Before we do that, let's apply this texture to our background. So let's preview what this looks like in our render view. Let's see how the lights have affected our textures, and how our textures have been affected by our lights, and how all the settings we've made will work. So first, let's go to our interactive render preview. We can go to this interactive render region. Now this will render this project in the viewport. It doesn't necessarily give you the best resolution so that you can still work faster. So that's why it's called interactive, so that you can be working and be previewing. You change a setting, then you see what happens. So if I put this on, you can then drag with this point to make it fill your viewport. Then you wait for it to render. This is the primary and secondary process of our global illumination doing its thing. So here's the result of the settings we just made. If you want to see this in the final render view, then we can come back here, turn this off. Then here we select render to picture viewer. It will take us to our picture viewer where we'll see the final render of this, and then your final render will show up here. If you want to reduce the time it takes to render, you can always go to your render settings, reduce the accuracy of your ambient occlusion here. You can reduce the global illumination to low, but this is reducing the quality. And then you can also change this to geometry here. So if you wanted to work with this and save it, after you've rendered it in your picture viewer, you can always go to your save icon here, or go to your file, then select save as, then select the format JPEG. Once you hit OK, to ask you where you want to save this file, then you can just rename this here, maybe render2, and then you drop it. The final thing we see is how to export this finally as a video or as an image directly to a file location. So once you're ready to render your final product, you go over to your render settings. We've checked all this, so now I'll set this to high, and I'll just make sure I'm using my best settings. Then output, we've already set this earlier. The other important area is here. So if you're expecting an image, you select the frame that you want to export. So take, for instance, if I take this to 31, you see now it has updated to 31, so it says current frame. So it will render this current frame here. But if we're rendering a video, then we need to save from 0 to 90, so it renders all the frames for us. Once you start inputting a number, it's automatically switched to manual here, or you can select all frames. So all frames will be 0 to 90 because that's all the frames we have. So let's make these settings for a video since we've made an animation. So after this, you go to save. So if you want to save this as a video directly, you go to your file, then you choose the name of your file. I'll leave this as R. I just want to save it here. Or I can change this to video render. Then under format now, you select MP4, and that would directly render this into a video. Before I go ahead to render, I just want to adjust something on our model. So if I go out of our camera view, I want to make this area of our mesh flatter. So I'll just select this object, I'll go to my polygon mode, and I can either reflow the edges here, or simply I can just add a loop cut, hit M and L on my keyboard and add a loop cut here, and that area will be flat. So to render, please make sure you are rendering in your camera view. Make sure your camera is active, and you can just play one more time in your viewport to see what you'll be rendering. That's great. So now we can just hit our render button. It will render all the frames and then merge it into the video when it's done. So when you're done rendering in Cinema 4D, this is what you will have. You will have all the frames from 0 to 90 rendered. So locate your file directory on your system, and then you should find your video now. Thank you so much for taking part in this series. I had such a great experience doing this in both Cinema 4D and Blender. You can now go ahead to practice with more products. Use this foundational knowledge you have to explore more tutorials on YouTube, and I'll be there in the community to assist you, so make sure you bring those conversations to the community. I'll also make subsequent tutorials and series, so make sure you subscribe and stay in touch. Thank you once again, and God bless you and help you in your 3D journey.